Welcome to the Story Detective. Writers know that words have power, and yet if you're not aiming those words in a visual way, you can fail to make that mental connection with readers. The question and the case before us today is, what can writers learn from sequential art, which is the same type of storytelling used in comic books and storyboards? The answers just may surprise you, and they're coming up on the Story Detective. Comic books have very strong symbolism, and nowhere is that symbolism stronger than within the characters themselves. Today we're going to compare two characters who had a similar yet different beginning and see where that leads. And that's Batman and Spider-Man. What we have to understand first of all is that what happens with a character, the components at work in their lives, before that big event in their lives that make them the hero of the story, is very important. Now with Spider-Man, those events begin with the death of his family. He's then, after being traumatized, taken in by his aunt and uncle, Aunt May and Uncle Ben. And they're also an older couple, so they're a little bit more mature, they're less angsty and more settled than younger parents would be under the circumstances. So Peter has a foundation that's more mature than most kids his age. Peter's flip side is he's dealing with abandonment issues. He's repressed a lot of guilt because when tragedy strikes in our life, who do we blame but ourselves? In school he's picked on by bullies, laughed at by girls. He's a bit envious of kids who have a normal life. So when he becomes Spider-Man, his first reaction is to become a superstar. That cork is out of the bottle. He's feeling free from his repression. And yet that one instance when he shirks his responsibilities and allows that burglar to escape, who later murders his Uncle Ben, the weight of all that comes back on his shoulders 100-fold. And now everything that Peter does as Spider-Man is driven by guilt and responsibility. Batman has similar origins in the fact that he also experienced the loss of his parents, but the difference is he witnessed it. So what we have with Batman, if you juxtapose that young Bruce Wayne over a young Peter Parker, is Bruce Wayne doesn't have the loving, nurturing older couple to go to. He has Alfred, and he has a big empty house. He has this business, which there's bound to be corporatists trying to take everything that his father built and everything from him. So if you think about it, there's no buffer between Bruce Wayne with that family unit like Spider-Man has. So that fear is kind of constant. Fear is a chief component in the life of young Bruce Wayne. It's an emotion he knows very well. So when he invents the identity of the Bat, what he's doing is taking everything that's pent up inside and bringing it into the exterior. He's doing a reversal so he can use that fear, conquer it, and manipulate it to use against the villains he encounters. With Batman, Batman becomes the chief character, and Bruce Wayne is pretty much an alter ego to Batman that he's escaping from. Think of the young Bruce Wayne that witnessed his parents being murdered. It's a dark night in Gotham City. And then think about becoming Batman, becoming the Dark Knight. And what he's really doing in every sense of the word is trying to literally take back that night when everything happened. The setting evolved from character? Well, let's look at some examples. Let's take Batman again. If you think about Gotham City, it's very grim, very eerie. It's a scary place. But if you think about the entire psyche, everything that's happening within Batman, when you're filming a scene, it's from the point of view character's cameras, which are his eyes, and everything he sees is colored by his emotion. In film, we have music to do that. It kind of tells us it's happy, it's sad, it's exciting. But the music when you're writing a novel or doing a comic book is pretty much the emotion of the character, because what they're seeing colorized by the emotion, and that emotion becomes the soundtrack or the theme that the reader's picking up on. What film and TV does is they're almost creating setting out of the situation, because what we mostly see in movies these days is a lot of extreme action or apocalyptic circumstances, and that becomes the main character in the movie. The characters themselves are kind of sprinkled into that plot in a way that it becomes a bit of a fish out of water story. For apocalyptic adventures, kind of like The Walking Dead, it works because you're taking a group of characters and you're placing them into that circumstances. But if you think about it, everything that the characters were before those circumstances happened kind of plays for or against the group and against one another. And people become the worst enemy, not so much the zombies. And that's why that show works, because it's still character motivated. Those characters still have a purpose and potential. What Hollywood is doing is we get a lot of cardboard characters, and the setting kind of carries us visually because the visuals are large and important, and that can evoke emotions, but they're not coming out with a lot of memorable characters of their own in film. But as writers, we have to do the work. We can't be lazy. We can't come up with a setting and hope that our circumstance is going to outdo all the characters and we don't have to think about that. Everything in a novel, whether it's a literary masterpiece or a story from a comic book, is extending from character. Villains are important. They're the other half of your story. And they get short shrift in a lot of movies and even some books. But again, the Hollywood villain, we see them doing bad things and evil things. So we say, okay, they're bad because we see them ready to blow up cities and murder hundreds of people. So we want them stopped. But in terms of the character themselves, sometimes we get very little, if anything. So my version of a villain and a hero is if you picture them hatched from the same egg, but within that egg is the yin-yang symbol. There's the dark and the light, and they all have that little eye, that little piece of one another. And when they're birthed, they're very similar and yet very different, because they both have the same story goal. They're both looking to be the hero of the tale that you're telling, but for very different reasons and very different methods. And that's what separates the two. Let's look at Spider-Man's villains, for example. They're all very much like a branch from Peter Parker's tree. He was a science geek. How many of his villains are scientists or professors at the university he attended? Or there's somebody that an accident happened to, much like the radioactive spider bite, but circumstances, again, make them very different. They're the dark side of Peter. And if you think about what we said earlier about Peter Parker, he has the envy, he has the guilt, and the villains. Think of how many Spider-Man villains are green, between Scorpion, Vulture, Electro, Green Goblin, Dr. Octopus, the list goes on. And green is the color of jealousy and envy, much like the young Peter who envied those other kids of having things that he didn't. The villains are very much motivated by all of that. And Peter is essentially, as Spider-Man, battling his darker side again and again and again. Same thing with Batman. The fear that he's trying to instill, if you look at villains like the Joker and the Scarecrow, they're pretty much pieces of Batman's psyche that's come into play, and he's battling his fear that's taking the form of monsters pretty much. And those monsters, how many of them are locked up in a lunatic asylum because Batman's also dealing with his sanity between the human side of Bruce Wayne and the dark side of Batman. And it's a very fine line to walk. The villains have just walked off that line and they've become insane. So, what have we learned so far? We've learned that it begins with character, and from the character grows your settings, because your settings are a reflection from everything that the character feels and colorize his universe. Villains are extension of the character because they're extensions of the character's psyche and the cracks therein. You need to consider all of these things for your story to kind of have that foundation. And once you get all those foundational aspects in order, what happens next is if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe so you can hit the bell, and that way you'll be notified of any new videos I post, because if your passion is storytelling like mine, we're just getting started here.